Do-do-do. Bum, bum, bum. Bum, 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 bum. Well, it's a wonderful Sunday. Some of you are off churching it up, but not me. I'm here working and drinking coffee and talking to you. So if you're lucky enough to be available, it's time for the simultaneous sip and coffee with Scott Adams. That's me. Raise your mugs, grab your beverage, and let's simultaneous sip. If you're still brewing, I see somebody's still brewing, we'll get you another simultaneous sip. All right, we have several fun topics in no particular order. Number one, I am watching with great entertainment and interest as Jordan Peterson is being picked to death by the lesser educated media. And I love it because he tends to say things that I have said in the past and gotten in great trouble. But unlike me, he can back up what he says. So the big difference between a lot of, I'm not saying that I agree with everything Jordan Peterson's ever said. I might. I just don't know everything he said. So I'm not disagreeing with him. I just can't claim I agree with everything because I don't know everything he's ever said. But he's getting in trouble right now for saying something I got in trouble several years ago. I got in trouble for exactly the same thing, or very similar, maybe not exactly. But he can back it up with research and, scholarship. So it's fun to watch him winning the fight that I lost. So I'm getting great entertainment value out of that. And the idea that he's putting out is that monogamy is good for reducing violence. I hope I'm not mischaracterizing him like everybody else in the world is mischaracterizing him. But essentially the idea is that if you pair a man and a woman, the man is going to be a little less violent on average, at least less violent to society. He might be more violent to the woman, I suppose. But in terms of societal violence outside of the actual couple, and apparently there are a number of studies in the biological evolutionary field that make it pretty clear that if you have a situation where the rich guy has 100 wives, you've got a lot of extra males, and they end up getting in trouble and causing trouble and creating violence and such. Now, when I said it several years ago, I said it without the benefit of any scholarly anything. Yeah, I might have linked to one article or something, but I just got eviscerated for the idea that there's something about, so let me generalize a little bit because I got eviscerated several times for related ideas. And the thought was, here's the dangerous part of the thought, that there's something about the way society is organized, not in every place, but we're talking about the whole world. There's something about the way society is optimized that's bad for boys. And that one of the side effects of that system that is not organized to optimize male experience is that the men who are not optimizing their experience get in trouble. Now, even listening to me say it, I'm going to disavow myself. So you should ignore everything I say on this topic because there are people who know what they're talking about. Jordan Peterson is one. Follow him on Twitter, and you can see lots of links to scholarly things which make the same point. So as we're trying to figure out what the heck's behind these school shootings and what the heck's behind all this terrorism and problems in the Middle East, and pretty much 98% or whatever of the violent people are males, and most of them are youngish. So what's going on? Now I tweeted this morning, but I deleted it because I got caught tweeting a fake Kanye account. You should never tweet before you have your coffee in the morning. Every time I've retweeted a fake account, which I've done a number of times. It's always before I have my coffee. It's like, let me retweet this. This looks good. Oh, it's not the real Kanye. It's a fake Kanye. But the point of it was still interesting, at least my point. So I was saying that if you're trying to understand school shootings, it's not that complicated. Here's the equation. Schools, all right, you need a school to have a school shooting. Guns, you gotta have guns. Boys, it's always boys. Bullies, there's always a bully. I'll bet 100% of the times there's a bully involved. An outcast who doesn't have a girlfriend. Relating this to the first point, it's a boy who's been separated from any sort of meaning. Doesn't see a path that looks like he's going to be on the winning path. That seems to be a path that other boys are taking. Then you add to all of the feelings that this person is going to have, the bullying, the lack of hope. Maybe there's some, slight or bigger mental problems that wouldn't have been a problem in the past. Because in the past, they would not have all these other elements at the same time. And one of those elements is, and this is just me talking, this is not science. One of those elements is video games and then the news itself about all the school shootings. Now, people will be quick to jump on me and say, "You idiot, Scott, why are you not aware of all of the studies that show there is no link between violence in video games and violence in the real world?" Well, I don't know if those studies exist or not, because they're not exactly what I'm talking about. I'm not saying that the average boy is influenced to violence by video games. All right, that's what I'm not saying. Likewise, I understand there are studies that also agree with that the average kid is not inspired to violence by a video game. Here's what I do claim. Something like, and this is just to make the point, an approximation, perhaps 1 out of 100,000 kids, boys, who are sort of on the edge, and they're thinking, I don't like what my situation is, what do I do? And what video games do, and what the news reports about the school shootings do, is they take an idea that might not have occurred to the kid, and they make it top of mind. Now, I don't need a study to tell me that people are more likely to act on things that are top of mind. Nobody needs to show me a study on that. That's just too obvious. All right. So if you add the fact that they think of this idea because of video games, because of the news about school shootings, probably takes both of those things. And by the way, who has studied video games plus the news? Because you'd have to study both. I'm saying that they probably interact just in the obvious level, not the kind of level where you have to study and really do a controlled experience, but at the obvious level, humans are influenced by what's on their mind. We are far less influenced by things we're not thinking about. All right, I don't need a study to show you that. So my point was, it would be surprising if we did not have school shootings, and it would be surprising if we don't have lots more of them. Now that's slightly different, the prediction that we're going to have them and more of them, we have all the conditions for that to happen and to be lots more of them. And nothing's changing. So there's nothing particularly changing that will change that. Now, the question of whether we could harden the targets, the answer is, I hate to tell you, here's the honest answer to can we harden the targets at the schools? I hate to say it, but here's the honest answer. We don't care enough. That's it. That's the whole answer. Obviously, we could harden the targets at the school. Obviously, we could protect all the schools. There isn't even the slightest chance we can't do that. We could protect those schools. Of all the problems that we have, if you look at all the big problems in the world, this is the easiest one. we could bring school violence, at least the mass killing types with guns, down to 0. Do you know what we would have to do to make that happen? Care more. We just have to make it a priority. It's just not a priority. Because most people say, even now, yeah, even with all the school shootings we've seen, the odds of my kid getting shot, still very small. But if you want to take another $1,000 out of my paycheck per year to cover all this school enforcement, that $1,000 is real. The odds of my kid getting killed, my specific kid getting killed, very small. So people don't care enough. That's the only problem. All right, we could solve it easily just by putting lots of guards, lots of, fixing some of the physical stuff. There's probably 10 ways we could solve it completely if we cared. So let's not pretend that we care enough to solve it, because that's the problem. All right. Now let's talk about, there was a fun study that Business Insider talked about. I tweeted it, so you can see it in my Twitter feed, and I talk about this more because it's fun and funny than because it's necessarily scientifically valid. All right. So I'm not going to put too much credibility in this study, but there was a study recently that said that journalists are below average in executive function and below average in the ability to get past bias. Now, I think it was a small study with 40 journalists or something. So it would have to be reproduced, lots of times before you could say there's anything to it. But it fits with my preconceived notions. So I like any kind of study that matches what I already thought was true. Whether or not it's true or not, I'm going to like it just as much. Now, my observation is that if I meet somebody who's, let's say, an engineer or somebody in the technical field, and I disagree with them. So this is a continuous thing I have. I'll meet somebody who's a professional engineer and they disagree with me on, let's say, politics. We'll have a discussion. I will note absolutely no cognitive dissonance happening in the engineer. The engineer will say, fact, show me your source. But pretty much, they're going to follow the fact chain to wherever it goes. And I've actually seen engineers change their minds in real time, which is kind of weird. You almost never see that, right? But if you give an engineer a new set of facts, the engineer will go, all right, I will take that new set of facts. I'll put that into the hopper and, maybe I'll change my mind. You do the same thing with a journalist, you will get anger. It's true. You tell an engineer they're wrong. What's the first, if you tell an engineer they're wrong, the engineer will have two feelings. They'll feel a little bit their ego, a little bit of personal, nobody likes to be wrong, right? So if you show an engineer they're wrong, they'll have two feelings. One is, I hate being wrong. I don't like that at all. But the other one that is unique to engineers and people who think like that, right? Not just the people who went through engineering school. But the other thing that's true of them is they're going to have a second emotion. The first one is, I hate being wrong. I don't like this at all. The second one is, this is kind of exciting. It's exciting to be wrong if you're an engineer, because you might be learning something. This might be improving your power. Because if you go from being wrong about something to being right about something, as an engineer, that's pretty important, right? So I think engineers are unique in that they hate being wrong like everybody else in the world, but they also like it because it means they learned something and they went to a better place. Do the same thing to a journalist. And again, these are gross generalizations. Of course, there are lots of exceptions to both groups. But generally speaking, you tell a journalist they're wrong, what is the reaction? It's not excitement, let me tell you that. They will write a hit piece about you, about what an asshole you are. So they definitely are different people. So it wouldn't surprise me to find out that journalists are uniquely biased compared to, let's say, people in other professions such as lawyers, doctors, engineers, technical people, people who are using logic and rationality all day long. Writers are not in that world. All right, let's talk about a clip that somebody sent to me and I tweeted around this morning, in which hypnotist Darren Brown, he's a famous sort of TV hypnotist, I guess, hypnotizes in just with words, not an induction, but just by conversation, hypnotizes actor Simon Pegg into believing that Simon Pegg had written a note in his pocket that said something different than what is said. Now, the actual situation was they asked Simon Pegg to write down on a piece of paper a gift that he always wanted to have, but he never got. So Simon Pegg wrote down on his piece of paper a leather jacket, sealed it, signed it, put it in this tiny envelope, and put it in his own wallet, where he is sure that nobody touched it. Then he goes to hypnotist Darren Brown, Darren Brown, who talks to him, and through just a conversational technique plus manipulation of the scenery in the room, which was probably the more important part, Simon Pegg believes that he wrote on his piece of paper that he wanted a red BMX bicycle. What he actually wrote was that he wanted a leather jacket. So Brown actually rewrote Simon Pegg's memories in real time while you're watching it, and it only took about 5 minutes. So in 5 minutes, by just the choice of words, Darren Brown, the hypnotist, made Simon Pegg, who knew he was talking to a hypnotist, right? So Simon Pegg knew he was in an experiment. And so he was, wary of all the tricks, looking for the tricks. Did it help him to know that he was being influenced? It did not. It did not. Now, if some of you watched the clip, I see the questions coming in. What do you mean by manipulating the scenery? What did you do there? If you see the room that they're in, the room is mostly two colors, mostly white, but there are lots of red accents. Red here, red there, red, red, red. So if you're sitting in that room and somebody says, what color bicycle do you want? The odds of you saying red go up by, a huge factor. And you would think it's because you prefer red bicycles. Now, red bicycles are fairly common, so you're also starting with something that's at least in the top, it's in the top 3 or 4, right? If you said, what color bicycle do you want? A top 3, top 4 answer is going to be red. So the room influenced the color by being only white and red. And white is probably a less popular color for a bicycle. At least you don't see many white bicycles. Then there were a number of round objects that were paired, like the wheels of a bicycle. You could see over the shoulder of the hypnotist there was an old style reel-to-reel, and the reel-to-reel is going like bicycle tires behind him. So while Simon Pegg is talking to the hypnotist, he's looking over the hypnotist's shoulder at two things that look like bicycle tires, but are not. All right? Then, and I will tell you that I saw the technique as it was happening. You could see that Darren Brown was using words that sounded like bike and BMX. So he was working them into sentences that were not using any of those words, but they sounded like it. So, for example, if you wanted somebody to think of bike, you might say the sentence. Let's say there was a store called Craftmaster, and you could say, "Yeah, I was parked by Craftmaster, bike." And you're trying to say by Craftmaster. If you said it quick, it'd sound like bike. Yeah, I was over by Craftmaster. Now that's the terrible example. I wish I'd thought about it a little bit more. I could give you a better one. In the actual clip, you'll see Darren Brown doing that trick, but more elegantly. So the word bike is not spoken, but you still hear it. Likewise, you hear BMX and X and stuff. So here's the shocking part. So once the hypnotist had convinced Simon Pegg that what he wanted was a bicycle. And also there was a very large box in the room, and the hypnotist said that the gift is in there. Now it might be a big thing, and it might be a big thing in a big box, or it could be a small thing in a big box. So the hypnotist says, the box is not a clue, the size of the box, because there could be a small object. Here's what the hypnotist knows. The hypnotist knows that the person seeing the box is going to logically know it could be a small object, but irrationally, they're thinking big object. And it was about the size of a bicycle, right? So the box itself was huge persuasion, even though the hypnotist said, oh, don't look at the size of the box. Because when you tell people don't think of the size of the box, what does that make them do? Think of the size of the box. And that's part of the trick. Now, what's interesting is that once Simon Pegg said, yes, what I want is a bicycle, then the hypnotist said, is that what you wrote on your note before we talked, that that's what you wanted? And Simon Pegg would be, yeah, I wrote BMX bicycle, of course. And then he takes out his own note in his own handwriting and opens it up and sees that it says leather jacket. And you watch Simon Pegg's reaction is like, I don't know what's happening here. Now, if you have not studied hypnosis, you probably think there was something about that was faked. Maybe you think that Simon Pegg is in on the joke. He wasn't. Because everything that happened would be normal within the hypnotist world. In other words, this demonstration, which seems amazing to you, would be ordinary for a trained hypnotist. This would be very ordinary. In fact, there's a magic trick I often did that is the same trick. So here's another way you do this, a version of the same trick. Let me just finish that point. So Simon Pegg actually rewrote his own memories to believe that he wrote a BMX bike originally, but in fact it was leather jacket, and it wasn't that long ago that he wrote the note. So you saw in real time somebody's memories being rewritten. That's the amazing part of the trick. Now there's a similar trick that I do, in which I'll take a deck of cards, and I'll pick one card out, and I'll put it aside, and I'll say, all right, I'm going to have you guess what card I picked. Now, if you do it with a woman, and you do it in a room that's got a lot of red stuff, you pick out what the subject doesn't know is that you always pick the Queen of Hearts. So you just, no matter what, you always pick the Queen of Hearts and you put it aside. Now, they think you've picked a random card, but it wasn't random. You picked the one that you knew would be most likely guessed. Why will somebody guess Queen of Hearts? Number one, if you say to somebody, think of a card. Just, think of a playing card. People gravitate toward the face cards. Very rarely will somebody say 7 of spades. They almost always say king, queen, jack. So the tendency to say one of the face cards is very high. Then, if you're talking to a woman, the odds that the woman will say queen versus king or jack, which are the male cards, is very high. And the odds that they would say hearts instead of diamonds, that gets a little bit, closer to even. But if you influenced your subject by something that made them think about hearts or heart surgery or Valentine's Day, if you would prime them with any of those thoughts and then put them in a room with some obvious red objects, the odds that you can get somebody to say Queen of Hearts, the odds of somebody saying Queen of Hearts is about, in my experience, 70% of the time. So 30% of the time I would just say, trick didn't work. 70% of the time the person would pick the Queen of Hearts and would be blown away. Blown away. Because they would think, and of 52 cards, how did you guess the one I was going to guess? And the answer is, you were always going to be in that area, and I just influenced you to narrow it down a little bit more. Same trick. All right. Are David Blaine's recorded tricks staged? Yes. Yeah, the so-called TV magicians, as opposed to the TV hypnotists, the TV magicians do not have an obligation to be honest to the viewers. They are an entertainment product. So because TV magicians their only obligation is to entertain, they can just use trick photography and anything else they want, and then just tell you they didn't, or just not mention it. And by the way, that doesn't mean that all of their tricks are TV magic. I'll give you a couple examples. You probably saw the famous trick where the David Copperfield has all the people stand in a circle with their arms around an airplane, right? So they've locked arms and they put an airplane in the middle, and then later the airplane is gone. But the people are still locking arms and they didn't hear anything moving, and how's that possible? Here's how it's possible. The people on TV were all in on the trick. That's it. That's the whole trick. There's a David Blaine trick where he levitates on the sidewalk. Have you seen that? You've seen the commercials where it looks like he just goes, and he goes off the ground and just stays that way about this high. Have you ever seen that one? Do you know how that one's done? I hate to ruin it for you. But all he does is turn in a certain direction so that the audience can't see that he's lifting up on one toe, but not the other toe. So he's lifting up on one toe. The audience is seeing the foot that's completely off the ground, and that foot is covering up the toe, but not the heel. So you see two heels off the ground and one toe off the ground. The other toe that's on the ground is covered, and it's this cool little illusion, but it only works for the people who are in just a narrow range of view. So when they film it, they just make sure they show it from that perspective. And the people on the sidewalk very likely saw how the trick was done. But then they will also splice in people who are answering different questions. So you'll see an interview that says, how do you do that? And the person on the street will give an honest response, and they'll say, oh my God, that blew my mind. I can't believe that happened. But they might not be talking about the same trick. All right. So the things you see from the video magicians, they have no obligation. It's not unethical. A magician is there to give you an experience and make you feel fooled. So how they fool you, it doesn't really matter because you're getting the same experience. However, the hypnotists, as far as I can tell, are actually doing exactly what they say they're doing. There doesn't seem to be much of any TV trick. Oh no, let me take that back. I'm going to rescind part of that. The TV hypnotist, like Darren Brown, does have one TV trick. And that is that if the Simon Pegg experiment had not worked, you wouldn't have seen it. And the trick that Darren Brown did on Simon Pegg probably works 70% of the time. So if it had been in the 30%, you just wouldn't have seen it. So it's likely that he would not do that kind of trick on a live stage. What was Kreskin? Kreskin was just audience participation. So Kreskin used to read the minds of the audience, and there wasn't much of a trick that. Those cases, it was either the audience was in on it, or the audience was filmed ahead of time so that they could see some stuff, or they had Confederates working with the audience. So for example, Kreskin might have, I don't know if he did this, this is just one way it could be done, could have somebody who's in the audience that works with him who just strikes up a conversation in the lobby before the audience goes in, and the person who's talking to him says, hey, got any kids, blah, blah, blah. Maybe they find out their name, and then they can use the name to do a little search quickly and find out a little bit about the person if possible, and then Kreskin finds all that out before the show. Those are just some ways they could be done, but they're not mind-reading tricks. Will I have Darren Brown as a guest? Probably not. What about mediums, the people who talk to the dead? Oh, I've done that trick. So you know the mediums who pretend to talk to the dead, and the amazing part is they seem to know things that only your dead relative could have known. I personally have done fake medium readings with people who were blown away by how amazingly accurate I was. The trick is called a cold read, where you make some assumptions about people that are just logical guesses, and you get enough of them right, and they forget the ones you got wrong, and you pretend the ones that were wrong were really right because you modify them after they're wrong. So there's just a technique to make people think you're getting information from their relatives when you're just making logical guesses. Yeah. Somebody said, "What's Dogbert wearing behind me?" That is a little space outfit from my book. The book cover, The Dilbert Future, from 1998 or whatever it was. What about cartoonists who convince people Trump is not a disaster? Well, you'd have to look at the data for that. How's that economy doing? You know, I was thinking about this yesterday. So Trump's been on the job for what, a year and a half? And it's possible, we don't know this yet, right? So it's too early to say that this is true. But it's possible that in a year and a half, Trump won 2 wars, North Korea and ISIS, and presided over the strongest economy we've ever had. As of yesterday, it looked like there might be some success in negotiating with China over trade deals. He's lowered illegal immigration. He's eliminated, so far, every actual ISIS, Al-Qaeda terrorist act on our soil. Have we seen one since he's been president? I don't think so. He's lowered taxes. He's lowered the deficit. And here's the fun part. The temperature of Earth has gone down since he went into office. Now, I'm not saying he caused that to happen. Apparently, the reduced temperatures were expected because we were coming off an El Nino or El Nino, and whatever's the opposite is lower temperatures after that. So apparently we're supposed to have a few years of lower temperature, and that does not invalidate the climate models. It's just funny. It's just funny that the one person most identified with climate skepticism comes into office and the temperature immediately goes down. I mean, if we're not a simulation, I don't know. I mean, it's a coincidence, but it's a fun coincidence. Yes, he's going after the human traffickers, etc. Now, when somebody says to me, as they did in this comment, what about cartoonists who convince people that Trump is not a gigantic disaster? I say to myself, we now understand the cause of the problem. As I started my Periscope, I said that there's a study showing journalists are easily influenced by bias compared, they're more susceptible to bias than other people. What we've seen is journalists who are susceptible to bias buying into a story of Trump monster, and then they convince half of the public. The other half was not convinced. But if you're on the side who believes, let me say this as starkly and provocatively as I possibly can. If you watched the Darren Brown exhibit where he easily changed somebody's current opinion and also their memory in 5 minutes using simple persuasion techniques, that shit's true. That really happened, and he can reproduce that anytime he wants. Not 100% of the time, but most of the time. Yeah, I believe the arm touches, by the way, Darren Brown touched the arm a number of times, and I think the arm touches were correlated when he was saying bike or BMX. I'd have to see the video again, but it looked like he was correlating that, so somebody would make a special note of that part of the sentence, but which would be, I suppose that would make sense. All right, so if you saw how easily people can be influenced, then the real world in which you're in the Trump derangement syndrome and you think that you live in a country managed by a monster, despite all of the objective data saying the opposite. Pretty much, there might be some exception. There might be an exception like, it's a fact that we don't have health care that we're all happy with, and it's a fact that race relations are bad. So those two would be, if you had data on those, I think that would show. But on every other level, you can see that the president's objectively, the economy is up, optimism's up, we're in good shape with North Korea, the wars, etc. So for half of the country to believe that they're living in a disaster run by a monster, the only way you get there is if the journalists take on the role of Darren Brown. That's how we're here. The journalists have taken on the role of the hypnotist who hypnotized just by language and just by influence of the room, influenced Simon Pegg. It's exactly the same mechanism you're seeing at play. If the journalists say it often enough, if they act like they're all on the same side, if they act like experts, if they give you one example after another to demonstrate their point, even if it's just confirmation bias, half of the country is going to buy into it because we're wired that way. And half of the country will be less susceptible to it because of the team protection. In other words, if you were on the team that is likely to support Trump, you're a little bit protected against the fact-free bias telling you to change your opinion. But if you're already biased toward not liking that side of the politics, it's very easy for the media to Darren Brown you, and that's what we're watching happen. Yeah, so the example would be when the media somewhat universally said, Trump is calling immigrants animals, even though right in front of them was the evidence that did not happen. So these people, you saw people rewriting their own personal history in real time, just like Simon Pegg did. And you saw how that happened. It's because the media convinced other people and convinced themselves, because it's sort of the echo chamber thing, they convinced themselves that they were dealing with a monster. So why wouldn't a monster talk like a monster? If Trump's a monster, why would we be surprised that he would talk in monstrous terms? But if you believe he's not a monster, you don't hear it. I listened to it live and I thought, how in the world did anybody interpret that as meaning all immigrants are monsters? Like, it was mind-boggling that anybody could have had that interpretation. But then you watch Darren Brown change the memory of Simon Pegg in real time and you say, okay, that's how. And it's not even complicated to explain. It's very simple. All right. Somebody says it's tone. If you're referring to hypnosis, some people think that the way you speak, the cadence, the timing of the way you speak, maybe the tone that you're using when you speak, a lot of people think that those are important to influence. They might be slightly important in the sense that if you had a bad voice, it might be distracting, but there's very little technique in the way you're wording things. And one of the best evidences of that is that some of the best hypnotists of all time had terrible voices, and they don't all talk the same. All right. Yes, let's talk about NXIVM or whatever it is, the cult. I think it's in upstate New York. It's getting some airplay, but not a lot. Just before I got on this Periscope, I watched a video clip of the leader of that cult, whose name is Raniere. I think his name is Raniere. And here's what was interesting. So I only watched 3 minutes of Raniere talking, and people sent it to me because they were curious whether he was persuasive or a hypnotist or whatever. And I couldn't tell from that one clip. I could tell that he was speaking in a way that would endear certain people to him. That was clear, just because he sounded smart and empathetic. So if somebody sounds really smart and they also have empathy, a certain number of people are going to be drawn to them. But the woman who was interviewing him, it was fascinating because I would have judged, how do I say this without being sexist or getting in trouble? I think I can say this just objectively. If you were to see the interviewer and then Raniere, the person being interviewed, on the street, you probably would have said that the woman was far more romantically and sexually valuable than him. In other words, he looks sort of like a nerdy, schlubbish guy, and she was unusually attractive, way above average. But what was interesting is if you watch that interview, she is clearly in love. If you look at the way she looks at him, it's love. Now, I don't know if they had any history, and that's why she is the interviewer. But it was kind of interesting to see how much, there's serious love in her eyes when she's looking at him. Is it an ex-girlfriend? Maybe it is. But to watch that indicates that he's got some persuasion power that's probably pretty special. Apparently he used it for evil, if the allegations are true. Please explain my tweet about John Legend, somebody says. So John Legend has been sort of the anti-Kanye West, and in public, trying to be friendly with Kanye, because I guess they are friends, but also quite aggressively argue against the idea that anybody should be pro-Trump, essentially. And what I'm watching is John Legend exhibit bias and hatred in his effort to discredit bias and hatred. So you're watching him become the irrational, angry, hate-filled creature, which are his whole point that you should not be. Now, I don't think he realizes it. Or maybe he does, I don't know. But it's hard to watch because he's going through something that, see, my guess is that he's a smart guy, but he's watching other smart people disagree, and it's causing him some dissonance. He's trying to figure out how he could be so sure of something while he's watching other people that he thought were smart have reversed from where he was to something different and defending it pretty well. Candace Owens does the cleanest example of defending that point of view. And for him to watch that and see that point of view is just more persuasive should, in theory, throw him into cognitive dissonance and cause him to act irrationally, if everything we've learned about how people are wired is true. You should see him acting irrationally. And instead of acting with love, which is what he promotes, he is acting with bias and hatred, which is quite palpable, to argue against bias and hatred. So it's the least persuasive thing you'll ever see in your life. And it's hard to watch only because his intentions are right. Right? So let me say this again. I don't want to be the guy who insults John Legend for simply wanting the world to be a better place and putting himself out there. So he's doing all the things I admire. He cares. He's got empathy. He's got skin in the game. He's putting himself out there. He's not sitting on the sidelines. His mind, his hopes and dreams, at least as far as we can tell, are all in the right direction. His mechanism, His system to get where he wants to go is completely dysfunctional. And so that's what Candace talks about. She's not talking about, hey, I want to get to a good place and you want to get to a bad place. Everybody agrees we all want to get to this good place. Candace says your system to get there doesn't work, and it's obvious. You can just look what results you got. Keep doing your system, keep watching the results. It's obvious it doesn't work. Then look at the people who have rejected that system, that way of thinking, that being caught in the past, that being caught in anger. Look at the people who have just translated their minds into, well, let me just use the stuff I got. Let me take advantage of the things that I do have. Let me look at the things I can do instead of looking at the things I can't do. And we note that those people get to a good place. So the hard part is watching John Legend, who I believe is smart and capable, engaged. His mind is in all the right places, but he doesn't see that his mechanism to get there is just completely broken. And there are better ones that are at least being suggested right now. All right, that's all I have for today. Does anybody have any question or comment about today's Periscope? I will give you another minute to weigh in. Yeah, so while you're making your comments, let me just talk about. So there's a story that Meek Mills, if I'm saying his name right, was maybe talked out of attending the meeting at the White House that was going to be about prison reform. So Jay-Z may have been part of that conversation. I don't know that he specifically talked him out of it, but after consulting with people, Meek Mills decided not to go because, the meeting was a sham. So some people are saying that this was really just giving the president, who's a big old racist in their point of view, they're just giving him a way to look good, and nothing can come of the plan. This is what I call the loser philosophy. This is about the cleanest example you'll ever see. Meek Mills, again, probably smart, capable, well-meaning guy. So this is no insult about the person, right? I'm only going to talk about the technique. All right? There are smart people who use bad techniques. It happens all the time. I do it, you do it. Using the wrong technique doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means you got the wrong technique. In this case, the correct winning play was to go to the meeting. Because you go to the meeting, you're part of the conversation, you raise your profile. Yes, you do make the president look less like a racist, and maybe you didn't like that part. But we live in the adult world where you make investments for bigger gains. The bigger gain is to be in the room. The bigger gain is to be part of the conversation. Now, I know enough because I have personally talked to somebody involved in the prison reform process. Right? So I've had a personal conversation with somebody who works directly for Jared Kushner. I know that this is a genuine, real prison reform effort. There is nothing purely political about this. These are people who really do want to fix this part of the world. It's unglamorous. It doesn't help them personally in any frickin' way. This is absolutely for the benefit of the people who will be helped. Now, to walk away from that meeting because of the smaller question, which is true, that it would make this guy you don't like, this President Trump you think is racist, it would make him look like less of a racist, and you don't want to do that. Let's say that's all true. It's still a loser philosophy. It's a loser way to go to not attend the meeting. Smart people attend the meeting. All right. Let me give you an example. I don't know if Hawk was invited to the meeting, but I did connect him to that process. And if he had been invited, I think he would have gone. So Hawk is a smarter operator, and he understands that having the right system is the only way you're going to get to the right answer. Now, that's not to say all of his systems are right, but in this particular case, they certainly were. Had he been invited, I think he would have gone because he would want to be part of the solution. because he's just operating at a higher level. Now, it's also true that for a younger performer, Meek Mills, let's say, he does have some legitimate career issues. And I would not fault him for saying, at this point in my career, I'm gonna protect my base a little bit. Maybe later, when I'm a little safer, I can do some risky stuff like Kanye is doing. I don't know what his thought process is, but I would not criticize Meek Mills for making the choice he made, because that's probably the right choice for him at his age, his place in the industry. Later on, maybe he gets a little more flexibility. He's trying to keep his base, and there's nothing wrong with that. People are allowed to make selfish decisions, and I don't judge people for making selfish decisions. More risk equals more reward. False. More risk does not equal more reward for an individual. More risk equals more reward for the average of the crowd. If it's something like investing anyway. For the individual, that doesn't play out necessarily. Looks like you just did, Scott. So I've seen this comment twice. Just did what? Tell me what it is you think I just did. I can't even tell. I don't even know if that's a criticism or agreement. We all make selfish decisions. Yeah, and that's allowed. I approve of selfish decisions, especially when you're explicit about it. In fact, if Meek Mills had said, look, I'd like to get into this political stuff, I think I could be helpful, but at the moment it would just be bad for my career, and I'll come back later when I'm stronger, a little more secure and where I want to be, where I want my family to be, and then I'll get into this stuff later. If he had said that, I'd say that's enlightened selfishness. I would not ask for anything above that. Clean coal. Why are we talking about clean coal? I will agree with you that there's no such thing as clean coal, as far as I know. So to the extent that President Trump is calling the coal clean, I'm not sure that even qualifies as hyperbole. It does qualify as hyperbole if it's cleaner than it used to be, I suppose. Yeah, cleaner coal. I haven't seen Trump's tweets from this morning. Brennan, Clapper, and Comey. Yeah, we've talked about them separately. We'll talk about them more. Oh yeah, so Elon Musk is talking about now his bricks a little bit more. So the bricks that are made from the dirt that his boring company makes when they make tunnels, he's looking at selling them for maybe 10 cents a brick, so that building a home would be practically free. Imagine, if you will, that wherever they build these hyperloops, you're creating the bricks, and then since it's probably not expensive land, potentially you could be putting the tunnels under inexpensive land, and then people could be building inexpensive homes on inexpensive land, the entire route of the high-speed tunnel, and they'd have access to transportation because they're right next to the tunnel. It's a pretty good deal. You need shale for good bricks, so there might be different criteria for different dirt. All right. I'll go look at the Trump tweets after this, and I'm going to sign off for now. Talk to you later.